Well, I knew George as a teacher at University High School when I was there in my youth of quite some years ago. And I knew him not only as a well-respected and liked teacher, but also as a coach. He worked with the athletic teams and was very helpful to us young boys in our development. I've always appreciated him, always remembered him. It was a privilege to be tutored by him. Thanks.
I got to know George when I started teaching at the University High School way back in 1944. We were both teaching math, but I couldn't imagine how come George was such a successful math teacher. But it didn't take long until I found out. He was a friend of everybody, and once you got to know him a bit, you felt like you knew him all your life. So George and I had a lot of very pleasant experiences together. I taught at U High for many years, and George was there, and then he went to General College, and I used to see him once in a while, and then the same thing was true in General College. The students always talked about George as being a wonderful teacher, and he was wonderful because he took every student into his care, and he was concerned about them, willing to help them, spend all kinds of time with it, to give them extra help if they needed it. So George made lots of contributions to many of his students. He was a great guy. I appreciate having known him most of my life. Thank you.
I remember George when I first came to General College in 1964 as a grad student and an instructor in the mathematics area. And George was probably the most selfless individual I've met in a college setting. He would spend endless hours with students. And again, until the flicker came on, the student never outlasted George when he or she came in for special help. He was a wonderful teacher and a fine man, and I felt honored to have been associated with him. My name is Dave Ekstrand, and I remember George McCutcheon vividly when I first was hired in the General College in 1964. I have nothing but positive thoughts about the kind of man George was. He was certainly one who a lot of us, or most of us, could look up to. I still remember George's deep, heavy eyebrows, his quick, purposeful stride, and his attention to detail. And if you were lucky enough or unlucky enough to go in to see him for tutoring, you never outlasted the man. He was always number one as far as spending his time with you until that magical light that math presents to us turns on. George was a tremendous person. I remember some of the early staff meetings in General College, and I see some of the people around with whom I shared those memories. And I can remember George being probably the first person to volunteer for yet another committee assignment. And Merrill Rasweiler, who was the dean at that time, would ask who would represent the college at this. George was invariably the first one. I feel honored to have been associated with George. I respected him deeply, and I'm very, very happy to speak in his behalf today.
You're very kind. I think the main thing was that my dad was always there for me, and I always knew that, no matter what, that Dad would get me out of any trouble I got into, and I always knew he was a really special dad. So I guess that's about it.
I'm Edward Clapp, and I think Mr. McCutcheon, like all of our teachers at U High, was an exceptional person, demonstrated great leadership, and always had a kind word for everyone. He was a wonderful man, and it was a privilege to know him and be one of his students. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Imogene Christian, and I went to U High and had Mr. McCutcheon at the first year he was there. He taught me algebra, and I actually passed, so he was an excellent teacher. And then I actually knew him better as an advisor to the Senate and to other U High activities. He was a lovely man, and he and Mrs. McCutcheon attended our 50th class reunion 7 years ago, for which we were very grateful. It was just fun. He looked the same as he always had. And this is very nice to be here with everyone and to see Mrs. McCutcheon again.
I can remember when I first came to General College as a teaching assistant, I would go and ask George for help with some math problems that related to my business classes, and he was always willing to help. He was so gracious. He was always willing to help, but you had to know that you had to have some time, because he would tell you the whole, he would elaborate. You'd get the whole part of that lecture. And as an answer, he was a dear, dear man. We missed him.
It does come up. I'm another one who has been honored to not only have known George McCutcheon, but have benefited from him tremendously over the years. He was on the faculty for about 30 years, coming in 1951 until 1980. And he taught math for us, the applied math, and he and Merrill Rassweiler taught two of the business math courses, which are really sort of the forerunners of our business studies program. Problems in business transactions and problems in investment transactions, and why we could use them now. Statistics was embedded in some of those courses at the time, I believe, and then became more of a freestanding course about 1959, and George was one of the primary instructors in the physics course. As Dave and everyone has said and will say, that George was very student-centered. He had immense patience and was extremely generous with his time, with any of his time. He always showed students genuine concern and respect, and it was real, and they responded to it. They trusted him. They trusted him immediately. And so he taught them more than statistics and math. He taught them to believe in themselves. And he served as a mentor to the student. In other words, helping some students more with other aspects of their life than the math or the statistics. And I recall several years ago in Falwell, walking past his office when the student was in there, and the picture always came to my mind of Socrates sitting at one end of the log and the student at the other end. And that was basically what it was. It was the same kind of effect. It was the perfect situation. He's always contributed to the Student Scholarship Fund in General College. In fact, when he got the Morris, H.T. Morris Award, the Morris Amico Award at that time, he contributed at least half of his of the amount of that towards student scholarships. George was certainly the perfect gentleman. He was the ultimate perfect gentleman. You always saw him in a dark suit, black suit maybe. He was always considerate and gracious and courteous to anyone. And one of the things that stood out in that line was, if you were walking with him from one building to the next, for example, he would rush ahead and open that door for you, no matter what. And one day, that got to be kind of funny. Some of you know Doug Dearden, who was a biology professor with us and kind of a practical joker at times. And there were a number of us walking from Nicholson Hall back to Falwell Hall, where our offices were. And all of a sudden we got near Falwell, and George darts out, goes to the door, opens the door, and Dearden said, "George, I'm disappointed in you. You prevented me from being a gentleman." I don't know how many, Dave, or was you in that group? Bill?
No, but I've had the same experience.
Yeah, yeah. And that's one of the few times that George couldn't say a thing. I mean, that caught him by complete surprise. Students were always more important than money to George. Specifically, when I was division head, I would get a note from the dean or the budget office, maybe Barb, I don't remember now, to remind George to pick up his checks. Pick up his checks. And finally, after several had accumulated, why he would go in and get them. And so I feel very fortunate to have known George. He was a wonderful role model to all of us, not only as a teacher, but also as a human being.
All said, okay. George was my teacher beginning in 1934, and I had him for 3 years in the Hanska High School. And I found out when I was going to be a freshman that I was having to take the course called algebra. I'd never heard of algebra before. But it got to be my favorite subject, and I think the reason for that was because he was such a wonderful teacher. Then in my sophomore year, I had geometry, and the junior year, higher algebra and solid geometry. Solid geometry wasn't in the curriculum, but he said he would teach it for anyone that wanted to take the class. So there were 8 of us that took solid geometry. And I'm sure he didn't receive any extra pay for doing that. If it had been nowadays, teachers have an extra load, they'd want something for overload. And one thing I remember, I think we were all pretty, well-behaved students, but there was one thing that he did not like, and that was gum chewing in class. So he had a jar that sat on his desk, and if someone chewed gum, he would just give the jar to the first one in the row. They'd send it down the row, so whoever was chewing gum would deposit their gum and send it back up the row. He didn't have to say anything. He just sent the jar down the row. And while they were living in Hanska, is the time that Arlene was born. And as a special treat to celebrate her birth, the whole high school got to go down to the local drugstore for ice cream cones. And if they probably were a nickel at that time, but I'm sure McCutcheon wasn't earning more than probably $100 a month. And we've had connections with them through the years, and they've always been very kind and thoughtful people. And my sister-in-law and I had good fortune of visiting with the McCutcheons 2 weeks before he died, and we're very thankful that we got to see them then.
My recollection of George McCutcheon goes back to 1938. He was a member of the Sleepy Eye Drum Corps as a snare drummer. And my dad was also a snare drummer with the Corps. So I was just a young lad, 12 years old, 13 years old. But I was also a drummer and I paraded with the Sleepy Eye Drum Corps as a mascot until 1942. 1942, the World War II was on and took many of the drummers out of the Sleepy Eye Corps. But that left George McCutcheon, my dad, and I. The first time I stepped into the competition field as a full member of the Sleepy Eye Corps. That was we got a comment from the drum judge that it was the finest drum section that he had seen, other than the one national championship corps that was located in Chicago, Illinois. After that, George was up in the cities, and I was still down at Madelia and whatnot, and I played with the Sleepy Eye Corps throughout till I moved to Austin, Minnesota. So that was really 1942 would have been the last time that George McCutcheon and I were in the same drum section. Thank you. George and Gertrude McCutcheon were about the proudest people ever. When I won the National Snare Drumming Contest in Philadelphia in 1954, and again in Dallas, Texas in 1956. That really made the McCutcheons proud. Thank you.